clarify one thing. The counterfactual that their side have to probably that is a world where, for example, Indonesia is probably just like retaining a very stringent, like standards on things like environmental regulation. To the extent that you have significantly less capacity to, for example, give out tax breaks to things like the coal industry, or for example, you actually have to put a lot of stringent regulation on things like coal industry and coal energy production, to the extent that, for example, it actually becomes more expensive worldwide. Also, I just want to also clarify that probably under their counterfactual, they can still fiat to some extent that this regulation will maintain the status quo, but I think it's also their burden to explain as to why this particular regulation will be sustainable enough to actually maintain long term. I'm going to prove to you as well as to why this is probably not going to be sustainable enough, which means that their environmental benefits are also not really sustainable as well. The first thing obviously I want to argue is as to why this particular policy coming from the Indonesian government this is very important for the Indonesian economy, and why in otherwise counterfactual probably the economy is going to be massively hard. The first reason for this is obviously nickel-related industry will significantly shrink. There are two reasons for this. The first obviously is because of the foreign actors, for example, like Western automobile companies, or for example, Chinese industries or whatnot. The reason why these people are going to lose their incentive to actually come into these type of like Indonesia to actually build certain infrastructures for things, for example, things like EV, which actually use a lot of financial or whatnot, is three reasons. The first is obviously the context. I think EV and nickel industry is a rising industry, and probably the Indonesian government, for example, I think is actually doing things like regulations to make sure that the foreign companies, in order for them to use Indonesian nickel, they actually have to come into Indonesia and actually build their infrastructure and whatnot. I think it is already a rising industry, and I think the problem, especially in the nuance here, is that not already like many infrastructures are actually built, but rather I think it is in the process of massively being built right now in the status quo. And that's why I think if, for example, the building cost or the prospective cost for you to actually produce things like nickel and produce things like EV massively increases because of the lack of things like tax breaks or whatnot, actually happens under their certain costs, probably I think there is significantly less incentive for these corporations to come into Indonesia. But the second thing also is that I think there is a competition between EV industry and other vehicle industry as well. Because I think, for example, when Western corporations like Tesla or whatnot, or like other like BMW, all those type of corporations are actually making EV. But I think that is also under competition between other type of vehicles that doesn't necessarily use EV at the end of the day. What this means is that in order for these corporations to perceive EV industry as something that is profitable and sustainable, there actually needs to be a profitability of that EV model and industry. But it's for us that EV actually becomes massively more expensive to the extent that probably it cannot really outcompete, for example, other type of vehicles that uses oil or whatnot in terms of its price. Then probably I think there is massively higher incentive for these corporations to deprioritize these EV industry within their own market. The last thing obviously is because the cost in and of itself is really huge. Because I think the nickel industry in and of itself is very energy intensive, which means that I think there actually needs to be a lot of like coal, for example, that is used in order for you to, for example, producing nickel, which means that I think there's a significant increase under their certain cost. They cannot simply say that, oh, but like you can still produce stuff. Probably you have to bite the bullet and say that the cost is going to massively increase. The second reason for this is that obviously it is also harder for domestic industries as well. But by the way, the conclusion for this first analysis is that probably I think these other foreign actors are going to retract, or even if they do not retract, I think there's going to be significantly less investment on this particular industry, and I probably believe that Indonesia actually is a developing country. They actually need an initial injection of capital, massive capital, and I think that is actually necessary for them to actually get more capital and to pull that particular capital into, for example, building these infrastructures. But I think the moderate influx of capital is not just enough for them. But the second thing obviously is very harder for domestic corporations, because obviously they don't have less initial capital needed. They also need more tax breaks and stuff like that to maintain their industry, because they are a very small corporation. They actually need more governmental support, but insofar as that does not happen, probably they actually lose the incentive and capacity to actually stay within this particular market. And obviously I think domestic industry is also very important, because when, for example, Indonesia is only dominated by other types of like industries, other Western and foreign industries, probably their own agency to decide upon stuff, or their economic dependency in other type of entities are also going to decrease, which means that the overall economic autonomy of Indonesia is also going to massively decrease under the rest of the house. The last also, I think the comparative advantage of Indonesia is obviously nickel for many reasons. The first thing is obviously because nickel is disproportionately distributed a lot in Indonesia, which means that they obviously have a lot of partnership upon that. But the second thing is that I think other type of like comparative advantage, things like, for example, you're just having more people, where you can grow things other type of SEA countries, for example, Vietnam, because they also have a lot of labor. They also have a lot of manufacturing industry, as long as, for example, India as well. And that's why I think there actually is a significant comparative advantage for this. And I think this actually has been revealed by the preference of the Indonesian government when they actually try to massively encourage, for example, other corporations to come into Indonesia, and that is mandated for them to actually develop it now. The second thing, obviously, is also to explain as to why usage of coal is actually important, because they have a lot of coal reserve. I think the Indonesian energy production itself is actually very dependent on coal, which means that insofar as the house, when the coal in and of itself becomes more expensive because of more stringent regulation, that actually harms a lot of industries and factories to produce methane good. It actually massively increases the production of that. But also, for example, when households actually need to use methane electricity and heat up their houses, heat up their food, that also takes a lot of money for them as well. What this means is a massive inflation is going to happen. People have to pay more for things like heating up their food, heating and using things like electricity. And also, it is harder for Indonesia to actually sell other products to foreign market with like cheaper prices for well. And I think this is very bad because obviously many people are under the poverty line. They actually do not really have much capacity to afford a lot of high prices of electricity and products in general. But also the government do not really have enough capacity to, fund things like welfare projects to the extent that they can actually support the people of well. That's why under our side of the house, when these type of production costs are massively increased, and therefore there is more vitalization of the economy and overall products and electricity just becomes more affordable. That is the benefit that we can also have. Then I just want to also talk about the environment as to why these farms are not necessarily big. The first is that obviously EV is also very important. I think a lot of vehicles in the status are actually just producing so many carbon to the extent that, for example, they actually harm the environment and whatnot, which means that I think also a very important benefit that we can claim. So normalization and meaningful competition among the EV industry. And then so far as I have already proven to you as to why the EV industry in and of itself is actually going to shrink. And I think there actually is significantly less usage of EV, significantly less production, or significantly less productivity of that particular EV industry, which means that, for example, there is less usage of EV. For example, there is less incentive and capacity for EV corporations to massively invest upon EV to the extent that the EV can be more energy efficient. EV can actually be more environmentally beneficial in the end of the day. That's why under our side of the house, we still that does have that benefit, and that's why I think those harms are massively mitigated. But the second thing is that I think in the long term, I don't necessarily think that Indonesia will be able to just endure all those type of plans during the rest of the house because of all the reasons that I've explained, like for example, things like inflation and whatnot. That I think there will be significant political push and impetus under the rest of the house to make sure that Indonesia makes life more affordable, and people are just going to hate that. And that's why I think there's just going to be more political unrest upon that issue. No, it's more likely that Indonesia is also going to discard these plans and whatnot. The problem with this is that at least under our side of the house, when these Indonesians still actually have some degree of regulation, then probably we still have, for example, like things like deforestation, like preventing things like deforestation, and all other type of environmental benefits still maintained under our side. Whereas I think under their side of the house, it's more likely that the entirety of the plans are just going to be discarded. I also want to do some weighing as to why, for example, the economy is much more important than the environment. The first, obviously, to argue is that Indonesia is not the only country who are actually degrading the environment, and also at the same time, they're a developing country. They're actually harmed from all the colonizers, and that's why I think there actually is Indonesia is not really responsible for all the environmental degradation that actually happened, and that's why I think they deserve to actually really just to pursue their own economic development to the extent that they can actually make their lives better as well.
Ready, panel? These rules changed in February this year. They need to prove that there is a meaningful change in the economy that occurred in 4 years. It's unclear whether that benefit exists, but it is clear that they're not funding general coal power plants, but they're funding captive coal power plants. Power plants that power a single business and not the general people. So they cannot capture the benefit of making coal and power cheaper for everyone, but they do pollute in every town. They do make the quality of life in every town reduce by increasing the amount of pollution that occurs. Two claims in this speech. First, I'm explaining why these businesses that they want to defend succeed regardless, which takes out their imperative in the debate and explains then that instead they're wasting money and there are harms associated with that. Then secondly, explaining why this is bad for the environment and why they can get ahead on this. Firstly, on why these businesses succeed regardless. Firstly, all the comparative advantage analysis done by Affirmative suggests that businesses still want to invest in Indonesia for nickel and other forms of mining. Secondly, you can make massive amounts of money as a company because these resources are needed for green energy and development into the future. And these are resources which Indonesia have plenty of. So you're going to be selling lots of these into the future, so you do not need subsidies to make as much nickel to get these things. Thirdly, these are long-term markets. You're going to be mining for a long period of time. The world will need these for a long period of time. So you can make money for a long period of time, and you only need to put initial investments down to access this. I know that mining it doesn't have high barriers to entry. Oftentimes in Indonesia often lacks a lot of regulations. It's very easy for individuals to open up their own mines, but oftentimes it's also supported more by transnational corporations. So the outcome is that mining will occur otherwise. This is not the debate, the change in the debate. What are then the harms of subsidizing these firstly, they just lose tax revenue under that side. These can be used for things that impact education and healthcare. So the life of an average citizen is worse off under their side. Secondly, they're just wasting these subsidies which can be used elsewhere in the world, elsewhere in green technology. But thirdly, these mines become less competitive. Under our side, we encourage the most efficient and cheapest mines to come afloat. These are then the ones that are likely to be best for the environment, the one that then best for the economy and allow people to get the most revenue out of them. So this is the most certain answer in the debate. So the way then is, even if there is no meaningful change in emissions, this takes out the mining benefits, and there are a set of extraneous harms that come solely with wasting this. And the final bit of framing there, I guess the final mechanism is why you still sell anyways, is that the US and other nations will always want resources like copper, and these are things that we want on a national worldwide scale. But in terms of individual energy, the ability to afford solar on an individual town level, the ability to afford solar for your business is something that's significantly harder to do, and this is where the Indonesian government should step in. That brings me into the second argument to explain why it's bad for the environment. Firstly, we're going to explain why this makes the nickel mining facilities better under our side. Because the premise here is, or the argument is just, because they want to access the subsidies, to access the subsidies, they need to rely on renewable energy. This just encourages these firms to use renewable energy if they want to do things like mining, if they want to do things like production. And so under our side, it just encourages more firms to take up solar farms and wind farms, put solar panels on their roof to do these productions, invest in batteries. And note the framing that they provide, that things like nickel extraction do require a lot of power. It's just that when you have coal power plants powering these things, that's a lot of pollution that gets produced. We'll explain the impacts at the end of the day. That means then that as a result, we get more efficiency under our side. We just get more renewable energy, which is good. These forced to innovate. These companies are forced to innovate in the solar market in order to get these government subsidies. Because if it's so necessary, then these governments pivot in order to get the comparative advantage that they identify. So these firms become cheaper. But additionally, the free market also rewards efficiency without subsidization. So those who go out of business under their side are those who are the least efficient. They do the most damage because they're likely mining more to get as much nickel out of these things. Looks like they're unable to decontaminate the water when they pollute from the nickel extraction. So these are the firms that are doing the most harms and the most likely to keep up afloat. We avoid these harms. But let's then secondly talk about every other business and why this gets better. Because the counterfactual under our side is that tax breaks and subsidies go to other green tech, go to reducing green pollution. So these things are uncontentiously good. So it means then that firstly, mining, that means we get these companies likely to access subsidies and tax breaks. That because mining is a large part of the Indonesian economy, so that means that we should have money that goes to other parts of the economy. There's more impetus not to worry about mining, but to put the subsidies and helping out other firms. But secondly, powerful and transnational corporations lobby for more subsidies under their side. They're likely to have the ability to reallocate their capital to ask for more subsidies. So if these subsidies are necessary, they're not going to the firms that they care about, they're likely going to firms which are not benefiting Indonesia individually. And because they have a sunk cost in Indonesia, because of all the other benefits, they still stay and they don't flee out of the economy even when they don't get these subsidies. Some examples then. So for example, renewable energy it looks like then we are able to help give more money to renewable energy production under our side. It looks like things like the EV industry, if that's what they want to care about. You can invest more in that because you have more money because it's not going to these mining companies and you can produce that more. You can also encourage the consumption of renewable energy on a local scale. You can subsidize individual firms and individual consumers or individual towns being able to buy solar panels or buy wind farms, which allows them to produce less. The framing then is that this is uniquely important because renewable energy is less established in Indonesia. Indonesia is looking to shift into manufacturing at the moment because it can increase the quality of life of its citizens because it can provide more goods for them to access. But green energy uniquely has higher barriers to entry, so capital is needed. Because these firms do not exist at the moment, we need to make sure that these firms have the ability to start up, that they have the ability to continue and don't get outcompeted by, for example, China. This encourages the uptake on the individual level, and this allows for these benefits there. The final thing here to prove is that they just get more coal power plants under their side. Because the framing is that a lot of these subsidies are useless to current industries, but it is useful to industries who want to build more coal power plants. And they can see that coal is already established in Indonesia, so it's something that it's very easy for these firms to opt into. That means they're more likely to get coal power plants under their side, but they're likely to occur close to the business, since they're subsidizing captive coal industries, or just for a specific nickel processing facility. These are facilities that produce smoke, which just kill workers. They kill people who have asthma. They leave people with, they decrease people's quality of life over time. They leave people getting lung cancer. These are concrete harms that you get from having more coal power plants. We should avoid these things at all costs if we can. But secondly, these are also incredibly resource intensive plants, both to build and set up, and we should prefer using these resources elsewhere. So then, the impacts at the end of the day is that we just get more green energy. And don't believe the lies inside Affirmative that green energy is unimportant. Jakarta is sinking at the moment at 10 centimeters per year. It floods every year. Indonesia is uniquely vulnerable to severe weather disasters. So it should be doing everything to prevent these things from occurring. And this is something, and any step to a greener future is positive. We do not need to reach a tipping point on climate change. We just need to have modern benefits to helping the climate to slow these things down, to help these people out. But secondly, you just get more global buy-in and support. When you're actively moving to support the Paris Accords, when you're actively moving to engage in green energy in a meaningful way, as opposed to trying to skirt this around, countries like the West are more likely to support you. They're more likely to help you out, and they're more likely to engage in your business. But finally, it's just good to diversify your investment away from mining. It means that your economy is less vulnerable to shocks, where if there's a massive fall in price. It means that you, when Southeast Asia is developing, you want to be able to compete there, and you want to be able to establish yourself there. And that means that this is useful if you care about Indonesia. We have benefits to everyone, proud to be there.
If it is the case that nickel production on both sides of the house is similar, we win the debate because on our side of the house, we employ more people that are currently working in the coal industry as opposed to displacing a lot of people. But the second thing is, if coal or nickel production on both sides of the house is similar, then they have no delta because the pollution also occurs on their side of the house. Even if you don't subsidize it, if the other firms are continuously coming in and using these coal farms, then it is unclear what the extent of environmental damage that happens only on our side of the house is. Because if it is true that there are incentives to do green technology, then it will happen on both sides. If it is true that there are regulations about green technology, it will happen on both sides of the house, which is to suggest that this only functions in a world in which the subsidy meaningfully reduces the production cost of nickel, and therefore the production of nickel through things like the coal industry increases. I want to talk about two things. The first thing I want to talk about is why we better protect people in the Indonesian economy. The second thing I want to talk about is why we think we're able to preserve the environment in the long run, but even if we don't do that, we're able to meaningfully outweigh. Three responses before that. The first is, they say we're losing tax revenue and therefore they can fund things like education. But no, this money is isn't disappearing into nowhere. Oftentimes what happens is that the tax breaks or a lot of the monetary benefits that go to things like these power plants directly trickle down to people working in there, because it means that if you have more money as a producer, you can build more plants, you can do things like employing more number of people within these things, which oftentimes means the money directly goes to the people on the art side of the house as well. I think the second thing is oftentimes a lot of the money also directly goes to domestic industries, as opposed to on their side of the house, where nickel production is largely led by foreign actors, which oftentimes means that a lot of the money on their side of the house actually leaves the country, as opposed to a lot of the revenue from the nickel industry actually directly coming into the country, because local workers are employed, local companies are also getting a lot of that money to begin with. The second thing is, they say on their side of the house, they will fund environmental energy. Problem, they don't explain why this is likely counterfactual, insofar as a lot of what that, if you saw things like coal funding on their side of the house, a lot of people are likely to be displaced, and this is likely very unpopular. They have to explain why the alternative is funding environmental energy, which is directly in contrast with like the big coal industry that Indonesia has. So it is unlikely that just because the government doesn't help like the coal industry means that like the money is going to go into environmental energy, because it is just electorally unpopular to directly fund those things. So they have to explain why this is likely in order for any of their benefits about environmental technology to happen. The third thing is, they say diversification can happen on their side because they cannot fund green energy. I think that diversification only meaningfully happens when the economy gets a lot of money, and therefore you have a lot of money as the government to reinvest into targeted sectors that you want to diversify into. So they first have to explain why you're able to diversify if you don't have the direct money from nickel production going into your economy in the first place. The fourth thing though that they explain is that like companies coming in will be symmetric. Like this is obviously not true, because oftentimes green energy is a long-run investment. So insofar as for companies to enter the country, they need to use a lot of setup costs. They need to burn a lot of coal, right? It is not like you build one solar panel and that is going to be it. Like oftentimes nickel production and processing is a very energy-intensive industry, which means that oftentimes a lot of countries probably are not willing to even enter in the first place, insofar as a lot of shareholders oftentimes want to earn money in the short run, as opposed to waiting like 20 years for their money to come in, maybe 30 even. So they have to explain why the long-run incentives of companies, private companies, are much larger than like the long-run interest if shareholders are involved. The first thing I want to talk about is then the environment. I personally just think that the environment is a bit less important in this debate for two reasons. The first is, I think the degree of environmental degradation is a bit unclear, insofar as there are, for example, like other countries that are also polluting, and oftentimes like environmental damage is something that sadly like spills over. So even if Indonesia pollutes a bit less, like maybe Thailand pollutes more, and then that pollution is also going to flow in. And then like oftentimes the waterways are connected in the sea. So it is very unclear, just because one particular industry uses a bit less, why the environment is meaningfully improved. But the second thing is, I think the environment oftentimes affects people in the long run, which means that the degree of impact is always going to be very unclear, because you cannot say who directly the environment affects, for example, or how many people it will realistically impact, which means that the impact on their side of the house is always going to be speculative, compared to the large numbers of people who will lose their jobs for sure when you don't meaningfully fund the coal industry. I think that's the clear trade-off that we're willing to take on our side. So I think that increasing the environmental impact on their side probably scales with their benefit of protecting jobs, because the more or the less production you have of things like nickel, oftentimes that also just means that you lose more jobs because you're losing, using less money in that industry. So if the increase of their environmental impact continues increasing, then the job effect also increases on our side of the house. What do I think the tipping point is? I think that if coal subsidy for nickel or coal is heavily subsidized, what that means is the level of the ability for you to produce nickel is just very, very higher, regardless of what firm you are. It is much more cheaper for you to produce produce nickel using coal. What does that then mean? I think that it means that on a global scale, a lot of batteries and EVs just get cheaper because nickel is the main ingredient for things like batteries and electric vehicles. This means that now companies have the ability to do things like creating cheaper EVs that can now compete with non-electric vehicles, which they currently cannot do, because it simply takes up a lot of money to do things like creating, harvesting nickel with a lot of coal. They say they're going to fund green energy, but oftentimes it is unclear why Indonesia just currently has the green energy infrastructure for this to be meaningful in the short run, which means that maybe you fund fund a bit more green energy. But insofar as it is electorally unpopular, and Indonesia currently doesn't have the ability to do this, it will probably take like 20 years until for the green energy industry to have enough capacity as the coal industry to do the same output of nickel. What that then means is for the next 20 years, you do not get cheap nickel, you do not get a lot of electric vehicles on a global scale. This impact is very important because nickel is used in all parts of the world as opposed to just Indonesia, which means that if nickel gets cheaper in all parts of the world, and therefore electric vehicles get cheaper on all parts of the world, that is a massive environmental impact on a global scale as opposed to just Indonesia. So if they care about the environment, I think we're winning over it in the long run. And obviously the long run is why you should care about the environment, because oftentimes environmental impacts don't happen directly, these things happen in the long run. So what really matters is like long-term impacts when it comes to the environment. The second thing I want to talk about is the economy, because there are three characteristics in Indonesia here. First is that they oftentimes have a comparative advantage, mainly in nickel, because all their Southeast Asian countries also can do things like cheap labor. Second thing is that oftentimes there are very large coal producers, which means that a large part of the economy is earning money from things like the coal industry. The third is that it requires large amounts of growth right now, because in order for it to move up to higher level manufacturing, it has to take up a lot of money when there is a lot of global attention in things like the environmentally free technology on our side of the house. I think that on people in the coal industry, if there are many firms that move away from coal and in their best case move towards funding green technology, that just means that there's a reduced demand for coal, which oftentimes means that a lot of companies have to be closed down. And oftentimes this, again, scales with their impact on pollution. So if they reduce pollution, more factories oftentimes are working in the coal industry have to be closed down. What that means is a lot of people who currently work in the coal industry inside of Indonesia have to be directly displaced, and they have to find new jobs because they want to claim that pollution is really bad. What that means is you have higher levels of unemployment for people on the ground, and these are the most vulnerable people who work inside of the coal power plants, who do things like blue-collar work. This means people directly die on the our side of the house. But the second thing is, this just means that the popularity for green initiatives just goes down, because it seems like the green initiatives are directly in conflict with things like green, coal industry, which oftentimes just means that in the long run, you have less impetus for things like environmentally friendly technology, insofar as the environmentally friendly policy was what killed my family. But thirdly, I think that on our side, you have more bargaining power, because the government can say, as a result, we're giving you subsidies, so you should do things like employing more local workers, so on and so forth. It means that if the government has a larger say in terms of like the subsidies, the government also has a larger ability to leverage that and make sure you employ more foreign workers. But the last thing is just can make domestic industries that currently don't have the capital to invest also in green, in like the nickel industry, and therefore also better able to help the Indonesian economy.
This is a negative team who spends billions of dollars, an affirmative team who spends billions of dollars in subsidies and loses billions of dollars of tax revenue, funding companies that either were already profitable or companies that were small and inefficient and were likely destroying the environment. This was a negative team that spent billions of dollars on green energy. That explained why the environmental harm wasn't symmetric, because the size of these subsidies was massive, and therefore the size of the investment we got into green tech was also massive. I'm first going to talk about FDI and EVs, then on coal, and lastly on the environment and why this is by far the most important argument on the debate. Let's talk about their argument on increasing FDI, because there are two premises to this argument and I don't think they're proved either. The first premise is that FDI will leave when you lose these subsidies, and the second premise is that FDI won't be replaced by the things that we would subsidize instead. Let's explain why the first premise. So firstly, to explain why it is unlikely that FDI would leave. And they already defeat this premise themselves in their first speech when they said that Indonesia has the vast amount of the world's supply of nickel. So obviously FDI won't leave, because where would they leave to? There is nowhere else in the world you can get nickel. So that should already defeat this argument. But we also defeat this in the introduction at first, when we explained that this policy was implemented in February, and if FDI had left before February, then it doesn't explain why it would leave now. Like, they have a timeline issue with their argument as well. I think the only way they can make this claim is if they prove that demand will reduce because people don't want to buy EVs anymore, and therefore I guess FDI will leave. But this is a very unintuitive claim that you shouldn't believe, because in the European Union, which is the second biggest market in the world, EVs are massively subsidized, which means there's a massive demand for EVs there, and that industry is rapidly growing. So they had to do a lot more work to prove this and say same claim to you. Obviously there was so much demand for EVs, obviously there was so much demand for nickel. Let's then secondly prove why the second premise is unlikely, which is to say that even if FDI was to leave these industries, it would just re-enter the industries that we are subsidizing instead, and we actually prove to you at first why it's more likely to enter these industries, for like that is to enter manufacturing renewable technology. And there are a few reasons that these industries are more attractive to FDI. The first is that there's a really high demand for getting more renewable technology because a lot of the world wants to make a green transition. And secondly, crucially, there's an incentive to try and avoid China, who currently does most of the manufacturing of green technology. So countries like America want to turn to other alternatives who can do things like make solar panels, which means there is a big room for Indonesia to enter the market, but also because there's a lot more room for innovation and long-term profits as opposed to mining, which has kind of already been efficiency maximized because it's existed for a long time. But what we explained to you is crucially, these have a high barrier to entry. That's why it is not symmetric having investment in these things, because it is really difficult to do things like manufacture solar power. You need a lot of training, a lot of expertise, a lot of materials, that then you had to provide government subsidies in order to get these businesses started in the first place, and that's why our subsidies were far more useful there than the types of subsidies that they were going to give. So when you gave industries that kickstart, when you gave them that subsidies, when you incentivized talent in Indonesia to enter green tech instead of coal, that was when those industries got far bigger, that was when those industries got far more FDI for Indonesia. But the last thing is just to weigh out FDI, because this is not an active debate. This is not about the interests of Indonesia. Climate change was a harm that impacted the whole world. So the extent of economic improvement for Indonesia they would have to prove to win on the economy is just exponential, and you should not believe they've even got close. I think we've actually proved to why we improved Indonesia's economy far more. And Indonesia's effect on climate change was massive. Indonesia is the fourth biggest country in the world and the 12th largest economy in the world. The policies it has, the amount of coal power it uses, does have a massive impact on climate change, and it does have a massive impact on companies in Africa who cannot afford to do these same sorts of things that Indonesia can. The last thing to say here is that this is cool. Let's then talk about coal and explain why it is so their mechanism on coal is to say that a lot of companies and people rely on coal, so it's bad and coal gets more expensive. But as we explained in the introduction at first, this argument has a timeline issue because these rules were introduced in February, and this is not a debate about like getting rid of the new rules, it's opposing the fact that they were ever introduced in the first place. Which means outsiders decide where the original rules continue, which means you don't have things like massive political backlash or the price of coal massively increasing and people getting really angry about it, or people losing their jobs, because there's no change in our world. Like their world is the world in which there's a change. So they would have to prove to you that there was a massive decrease in the price of coal on their side, they created more jobs in coal on their side. But I think that this is unlikely for a few reasons. And the main reason is that they don't actually prove why coal benefits from these subsidies. Because if it is the case that coal is so integral to the Indonesian economy currently, that suggests to you that it's probably already pretty profitable, which means it's unclear that if they get more subsidies, it's unclear that they would put that into making coal cheaper for everyone else. I think instead, if you give a profitable company more money from the government and more tax cuts from the government, I think the CEOs of the company would just keep that money for themselves and just take it as company profit, or distribute it to their shareholders and something like that. They don't prove why there's an incentive for companies to use these subsidies to make coal cheaper, and crucially for coal, there's no incentive to compete on price, because consumers aren't like buying coal from coal companies, like you just get your energy provided to you by the government. So I think when all coal companies are receiving these subsidies, there is no incentive for them to use them to make energy cheaper. So I don't think they've got any meaningful change on the cost of coal there. The last thing here is that potentially you lose jobs because like you shut down coal plants. But I think that we are creating those jobs on our side when we invest in green tech. The jobs that we create are better jobs because they're more highly skilled, which means that a larger amount of Indonesia's workforce gets paid more money, which is a good thing for the development of Indonesia. Alright, let's talk about the environment and explain why we were winning here and why this was the most important impact in the debate. Their only claim on the environment is to say that when you make nickel more expensive, this makes it harder to make EVs, and therefore, I guess, like, you have less EV development, which is bad for the environment. But for the same reason that I told you it's unclear that the subsidy makes coal cheaper, it's also equally unclear that the subsidy makes nickel cheaper. So I don't think it's necessarily true that it makes it easier to produce electric vehicles on their world. It's probably more likely that the extra subsidies just go into the pockets of the executives of these companies. But secondly, it is just not a true premise that it is more expensive to make nickel with renewable energy. In fact, in the current world, solar is getting really, really cheap because China has a massive oversupply of solar they're trying to get rid of by selling out to the rest of the world, including Indonesia, which means that it's actually very easy to employ solar energy and do that in your nickel farms. But secondly, solar is also really good for companies because it's a one-off investment. That is to say that once you install the solar panels, you can get energy from that like forever. Whereas with the coal plant, you have to like continually pay to continually process that coal and turn that into energy. So that means in the long term, it's far cheaper cheaper investment for companies to have solar, but that also explains why you have to subsidise them, because they might not want to make that initial cost in order to get the long-term benefit. We enable them to make that initial cost by giving them the subsidy if they are willing to opt into that, which is why it was at the very least symmetrical, like how cheap it was to make nickel using solar, and right outside perhaps even cheaper, so maybe we can even co-opt their benefits there. So that should show you that their argument on EV is just, I don't know, it didn't sound, it didn't make sense. Alright. Let's talk about their responses to our argument on the environment. We gave you massive benefits on the environment. We told you that we use these subsidies for far better things. We told you that we got rid of small companies who were doing mining really efficiently. This is really important. Their response to say it's unclear that subsidizing green energy is the alternative. Like, this is the debate. The debate is that you invest in things that support the transition to net zero, which is renewable energy. Unless I can point to another example of something that would support the transition to net zero, and even if they can, I'm sure it's still a good thing on our side, obviously. But we also gave you a lot of incentive to say that the likelihood is manufacturing green technology, because there's a lot of demand for it. People want to replace China and things like that. They then say that these things take a long time to get a profit, or maybe that's why it's good to subsidize them, like we allow companies to overcome that initial step. But also, I think that it's unlikely that it takes 20 or 30 years. It's pretty uncharitable. Perhaps you maybe have to wait like a year to get your profit. I don't think that's particularly bad. And maybe like the intuitive analysis here is that like companies are making massive profits with solar in China, and they've only been doing that for a few years. It doesn't make sense to me that this is something that takes a long time to get a profit. I think this was an appealing industry, which is hard to make that first step. And the last thing is that this is symmetric, i.e. do you mind the same amount of nickel? This misunderstands our mechanism of how we improve the environment, which is not in reducing mining, but in promoting other forms of green technology. And it also doesn't explain why, because we explained to on our side, we produce the same amount of nickel, but we produce it in a more green way, because we force the nickel companies to do things like use solar instead of relying on coal power. So that means we are far ahead on the environment. This was the most important harm in the debate. And even if you didn't believe we were ahead on the environment, we just give the Indonesian government, like, we stopped them from wasting money on subsidies. It did not matter. So clearly I didn't debate right now.
At this point in the debate, you could believe one of two facts. First is that coal and nickel in Indonesia is a critical industry for the electric vehicle market, and everyone in the world needs it. If that's the case, the debate instantly falls to side negative, because there's no reason for the government, public entity, to pump money into this incredibly lucrative industry. You could also believe the second fact, and that is the coal and nickel market in Indonesia is dying. And that means that Affirmative will also lose, because they never explain why these markets are dying. And the reason of this is intuitive. There is just a lack of investment confidence in coal, and the physical coal in the ground is running out. So let's say they extend the coal market for 10, 20, 30 years. The question is, what happens when all the coal runs out? And they never provide a meaningful solution. We are the team that enables a smooth transition to other labor markets, to renewable sources of energy, to ensure that when that does run out, when the investment does eventually stop, we still have energy. The absence of that mechanization inside Affirmative should lose them the debate. They only stave off the inevitable. We ensure we shift Indonesia into the future. Two questions in the speech. First of all, on the economy of Indonesia, and second of all, on the green transition. The main claim from side Affirmative on the economy of Indonesia is that by subsidizing coal, they can ensure that firms enter Indonesia and thus everyone in the country has energy, nickel, etc., etc. But the first and most destructive response to this that we have been saying down the bench is that the firms that want these resources currently engage in Indonesia, because first, resources like coal where needed and copper where needed and nickel where needed just have sufficient demand. Like, people already need these resources, and it's just unclear why people haven't made decisions like this. Additionally, we explained to you that Indonesia does in fact have this current comparative advantage. What this means is that in the absence of any explanation from this team as to why firms aren't investing in things that would actually be in their interest, they just get a huge oversupply of these industries and a huge oversupply of coal. It is just unclear they get a benefit. They have two responses to this first response, and they're saying, first of all, it is really expensive in the short term to do things like build coal and nickel resources, and this means you need a government subsidy, otherwise the shareholders would be really upset. Like, actually, come on, this is a mining company they're talking about. These operations stretch out for decades. It's just unclear that someone who buys shares in a mining company is like, I need profits now, otherwise they'd be a day trader or something. I don't actually think this mechanism works. The second response is saying that, well, if firms do, the second firm is that like, oh, well, maybe firms will still come in and that's a big benefit. But just like, I think the firms that we're talking about in this debate isn't like a startup market where everyone and their friends just starts a copper or nickel mine. These are large firms that have operations in many, many countries. So it's just unclear that they currently don't have the money to invest in this and that they otherwise wouldn't have already entered the market. As a result of that, oh yeah, and finally their worst case scenario here is just like, it'd be really bad if they did invest in Indonesia, because then this means people would buy these resources from other places. The main response to this is just like, why on earth should we care about about that. This isn't an activate. It's fine if this money flows to a different country. And second of all, this does just seem like a benefit. If people are getting these resources in a place that is cheaper, a place that is more efficient, this captures all of their benefits, and the cost of EVs going down, and the benefits to the environment being higher. I literally don't know why that is an impact from their side. But the second response we give, and they never touch, is that the ways that this subsidies would work wouldn't actually improve these companies and increase the amount of money they have. Because first of all, the firms that currently exist, predating the subsidy, do not need this subsidy because they decided this was a fine endeavor before the subsidy was engaged. This means that they simply would operate on either side of the house. And second of all, the new firms they hope to convince are simply non-existent. Because first of all, most of the mining sites are just currently occupied. You can't just mine anywhere. There's a finite amount of places you can get it. And the large firms have already captured because it's profitable. And second of all, just like it isn't a startup market, it is just unclear that is a benefit. But third of all, they never respond to our mechanism about how asymmetrically driven these subsidies and tax rates are going to be. Because the largest, most profitable, most powerful firms are the ones that can lobby governments to get all of this money. The small firms they hope to enter the market just simply don't have that level of power, so all of this money, all this economic benefit just doesn't go to them. But the response is that even when it does go to these companies, it doesn't help the country. Because when you subsidize a company directly, they don't benevolently just be like, I shall now give my workers more money and I shall lower the price of all of my resources. They just take more profits because that's what a company does. They never explain the trickle-down mechanism there. I don't actually think it helps. But fourth of all, even if all of that was untrue, this is a bad industry for the economy of Indonesia to be reliant upon. Because first of all, the workers who do inhale smoke and they die of cancer because of it. It's because there is direct pollution and smog in the air around these power plants. It is because there is waste given on the environment for every day these power plants are open. They say, well, this doesn't create a tipping point for the environment, so this means you can't solve climate change. But we're not trying to solve climate change, we're trying to explain that the local town doesn't drown in smog, or the local workers don't die 20 years early. That was never the claim, and they never responded to it. This means that we impact the environment in the ways that matter on a local level, on a way that actually assists everyone. Their final dying breath on the economy is saying that this stops dependency on various TNCs, but they're literally subsidizing multinational coal companies. I don't know why they stop dependency. They simply put all of their money on an industry that is already dying. As a result of all of that, they do not improve the economy of Indonesia, and even if they did, this is instantly deleted by the analysis of my introduction. What does this team do when the coal runs out? They do nothing. We provide a transition. Second question in this speech on the green transition. A few claims here. Their first claim is that, because we explained to you that in that first issue, firms currently have an incentive to do things like mine copper, coal, and whatever is beneficial. And they try to flip this and say, well, if firms already have these incentives, this means there is no benefit to us on the green transition. The environment issue becomes a wash. But first of all, as explained before, firms can just produce more than is needed. So if there is a subsidy, they'll just open another coal power plant and another wave of mining operations that wouldn't have otherwise been profitable in the absence of this government subsidy. So it is just unclear that they don't actually increase it to a way that is gluttonous and a way that is lucrative. But second of all, we explained to you the new mining operations are just powered via green energy. So this means these companies can still access all of these subsidies. But this is hugely beneficial because one, it creates competition within the green energy sector in a way that is eventually helpful to everyone because the technology is propelled forward. And second of all, you just don't emit a whole bunch of coal. Their responses to this is just like, first of all, it is deeply implausible this money goes to green energy. This is kind of a funky response because first of all, the money stays in the pool that would have been diverted to the net zero by 2060 fund. So this means it does go to green energy, like definitionally that is how money works. But second of all, people are going to need an alternative energy source in the absence of coal because they say coal is going down, coal is running out, thus we must prop it out. This means you must believe in the absence of propping up coal, people are looking for another way to get energy, and this means there is huge popular demand to do things like invest in wind farms, solar panels, hydropower. So it is just unclear that the money doesn't flow this way. And third of all, even if it couldn't work like that, TNCs do engage to fill this niche. They say that, there just aren't enough skills in Indonesia to do things like build solar panels. Kind of a funky claim. Like, first of all, you can import them from elsewhere. Second of all, you can employ people through this kind of business. And third of all, Indonesia is one of the largest companies in the world. I'm sure you can find a couple of people and put them in a room to build a solar panel. It's not that hard. As explaining that, we do in fact get more green energy. The other push is just like, this means that we get more EVs because nickel becomes cheaper. But first of all, nickel was never a limiting factor for electric vehicles like anyway. It is the lithium you put in batteries. I don't know why this is a claim they hang their hat on. And second of all, it's just so easy to trade this off. Because they're like, we get electric vehicles, but the cost is they build hundreds of new coal power plants. I literally don't know why those are anywhere additional. Why those are anywhere symmetric. As a result of that, it creates a huge harm to the environment. What are our benefits that they never engage with here? First of all, we explained to you that coal is dying and thus it is bad to invest in it. Because first of all, the government can never allocate their money to things that are uncontentiously good, such as hydropower, such as wind power, such as solar power. They can never do things that can ensure a smoother employment transition. And second of all, we explained to you it saves the money of the Indonesian government. Because first of all, they now no longer lose tax revenues from huge companies that dominate the economy. And second of all, we ensure that they just have more money to spend on things like welfare and on things like the environment. This is a team that tries to live in the past. We are a team that propels Indonesia into the future. And we're proud of it again.
3 questions in this reply. Firstly on coal power plants, secondly on EVs, thirdly on the environment. Firstly on coal power plants. The only information you have in this debate and what is necessary to gain their benefits is that they need more captive coal power plants. They refuse to defend these harms down 3 speakers. Because at first and down the bench, we proved that they get more captive coal power plants, that power a single mine and power a single company. These certainly pollute on a more local scale. These are certainly built in local towns. And they do not respond to this down the bench. Why should you care about certainty in this debate? Because we should not toil with the lives of citizens. We should not say that deaths are a meaningful trade-off for climate change because they cannot live. Because life only matters if you're living healthily. And these people should not be left to cough up blood. They should not have their fitness winded. They should not be left scarred for life because a new coal power plant was built in their town by this policy. We avoid these harms to citizens. And this is by far the most certain harm in the debate. Because everything else was incredibly unclear. How it impacted the cost of EVs was unclear. How it impacted the environment was unclear. But when people breathe smoke, when they breathe smog on a daily basis, it did slowly kill them. And that's why you should weigh this as the highest harm in the debate. When we had 1 less coal power plant, 1 less near your home, 1 less near your work, this was a massive increase to your quality of life. This is the first unresponded victory path for side negative. Let's secondly talk about electric vehicles. Because side affirmative need to explain why a subsidy is necessary to supply nickel. We prove at first why you do not need a subsidy and why there's a lot of nickel mining elsewhere. They do not rebut this down the bench. And all of their analysis in fact suggests the opposite. They suggest that there are a bunch of coal reserves, there exists in the technology, that coal is cheap. Then why the hell do you need to subsidize it at the moment? This is the question which they never answer. So the outcome of this is 2 things. Firstly, it's unclear whether they ever changed the cost of EVs. They do not complete this analysis. But secondly, even if they change the cost of EVs, it's unclear how much change actually occurs. They never concretize or weigh this. And the intuition pump is nickel is a global market. It's unclear how a single country like Indonesia can have massive impacts in the price of nickel on a global scale. And so it's unclear how much they change the cost of EVs. But finally, we explained that EVs are made on lithium, not even nickel. So that's the main cost, made at third. They have 2 final Hail Marys to this. They're like, they can affect local companies now due to bargaining. Firstly, they never prove that these companies have the power to get these subsidies. We prove at first that TMCs have the power to lobby for these subsidies. They have power over the government to do that, and as a result, they don't respond to this. So it believes that they don't even get funding to these local companies. But even if they never prove why it's good to fund a local company, like, third negative proves this. And finally, at third affirmative, they're like, we make nickel more expensive because we force them to use a more expensive form of power. But come on, guys, that's not the info side. They can choose which power that they want. But we explain at second why solar is cheaper under our side because China has an oversupply. We make it cheaper through our tax breaks and our companies. So if you care about nickel mining being cheaper, we fix this and flip this at second negative to no response. Final question then on the environment. The environment, we explain why companies are now incentivized to buy renewable energy. We explain how we get more manufacturing, both on an individual and local level, because you just directly fund this with your tax money. You as a nation, because climate change was an existential threat, you needed to do as much as possible to combat it. Because nations had the highest obligation to humanity to stop climate change. And so even if we are only making a 1% dent on climate change, this was massive and meaningful. We explained that we didn't even need to reach a tipping point, but any change to help the environment was a positive one. And their explanation as to why they're super reliant on coal suggests that you have even more impetus to wean off coal. You have an even more environmental impact if you can get off coal at the end of the day. Because what's happening is Jakarta is sinking. Towns and roads are being flooded. People are fearing for their lives. We should protect the environment. Proud of the day.
question to ask is, did they meaningfully mitigate our economy argument? Because their main response here is that, oh, but they are still going to come in. But I think the observation here is that it is very irresponsible to our whole narrative, because this is not just about the presence and the absence of FDI, but it's more about the degree of willingness to invest upon that actually translated into, for example, more willingness to build plants, more willingness to actually hire people to the extent that you actually get the money. That's why I think two impacts still remain. The first is that this was the momentum for the Indonesia's economic growth. It is a lie that Indonesia is already wealthy. You actually need massive initial injection of money to actually build more things, to actually make sure that you get more welfare to the people. And that's why I think, just the intuition pump here, green tech has been long-term investment for 30 years, but it's still not replaceable of things like coal and mine. And that's why I think even if it's a long-term investment as in EV and nickel, as they actually characterize, I'm really not sure about the degree or the extent of investment that is going to be given to Indonesia. And that's why I think a negative replies idea that coal is anyway cheap is also very irresponsive, because what we actually told is that you cannot really tap into things like other types of coal. And also they just wanted to push the burden to our side by saying that you only have to rely on captive coal, then probably that actually increases your burden under your side of the house as well. Because insofar as you only have to rely on one source of coal, probably that also means that you have to increase, for example, the price or the cost of actually using that coal as well. But the second thing impact, and we also told you, is that on a micro scale, because of the higher cost, because of the reduced investment, they actually have to lay off more people. People actually have to lose more jobs, because otherwise under our side of the house, you could have expanded your market, expanded your industry. You're not doing that. And then their second response here is that, oh, but company executives are evil, they only put their money into the pocket. But this is also irresponsible, because we told you that this is massively crucial for your profitability. It's not just added revenue, it's not just added tax cut. It's more of a tipping point of you actually having more competitiveness and profitability in the overall vehicle market, because you are very desperate. You actually have to compete against other type of vehicles that are not EV as well. It's extremely unclear as to why this is a likely case scenario that these profit incentive individuals are necessarily going to put their money in the pocket. We tell you, because of that particular selfish and profit-oriented incentive, they do reduce costs in the end of the day. And then they say that, oh, they don't really, or they only take the profit, people on the ground cannot get benefits, but they get jobs. And also government things like tax. I'm really unsure as to why that's a big part. Then they say that last year, you can re-educate the people and put into, for example, renewable energy industry. This is very, very counterintuitive, because a person who is laid off from a coal mining industry now is going to a solar panel industry and doing all those type of high-tech jobs. It is extremely unclear as to why the skills are transferable to the extent that these people can actually get jobs in the end of the day. That's why people are going to lose jobs, people cannot have transferable income, and that's why the overall economy also gets bumped. Then let's say about the environment. Their strategic mistake is because they only wanted to say that nickel industry will survive regardless. But if nickel industry is equally resource intensive, then probably all of the environmental harms also happen. The only way for them to actually prevent that is by massively compensating that by doing things like a lot of green tech investment. The first thing we countered was about the incentive of the government to do so, because people massively don't like it. But secondly, also talk about capacity, because you are barred from things like patent laws to make sure that you develop your own technology. And then they say oh, but China has a lot of cheap solar panels. Yeah, that is true. Maybe you can buy a lot of cheaper solar panels, but you never explain as to why that degree of increase of green energy is necessarily going to be as equally efficient as using coal in terms of developing a lot of nickel in the end of the day. Because everyone concedes here that nickel is a resource intensive industry, then it's their burden to actually prove as to why this particular replacement of renewable energy is necessarily going to reap the equal degree of efficiency under their side of the house. They never meet that burden. So, no, you get the certainty